What I want to do is to do a kind of really a continuation of our summer series. What's our summer series been on? Great questions from the Old Testament. So I just went to the list that I sent out to our speakers. I picked a great question from the Old Testament that nobody had taken thus far, and I said, I'm just going to deal with that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a study of what have they seen in thine house. Our texts for tonight, they're going to be three different ones. I'm going to give you just, while I'm talking a little bit, turn to 2 Kings 20, Isaiah 39, and 2 Chronicles 32. This will officially close out our summer series. We thought it was done last week, but I got to thinking about that, and I thought, I really don't want to teach just a little bit of intro to Revelation, because honestly, the book of Revelation, just the intro is going to take us a few weeks. And so it would really be awkward to start that and take 3 weeks in between before we picked back up again with that study. So I thought we'll do one more summer series, great question from the Old Testament. 2 Kings chapter 20. And I'm going to ask Billy, do you mind getting the 2 Kings 20 passage?
No, sir.
Are you saying no, sir, you won't read, or you don't mind?
Yes, sir, I will read.
Okay. I just want to clarify. Brother Bob, do you mind taking the passage in Isaiah 39? It's the entire chapter, verses 1 through 8. And let me get one more person. I just sometimes call on folks. Brother Martin, 2 Chronicles 32, 24 through 26, and then grab verse 31 after that. Are we all there? I wanted to give you time to kind of get a bookmark in each passage or something, and so we can quickly go between these texts. All right, you ready, Billy? Okay. All right. I was all set to target you again there, Billy, Hezekiah. And then I looked, and it actually is the pronunciation in my Bible there. It's got a long E there. So I've always said Hezekiah, but it actually is a long E in my Bible, Hezekiah. Anyways, I'm going to say Hezekiah because I'm going to say Hezekiah because that's how I've always said it, and old habits die hard. But thank you, Billy. I know you got the passage with some of the I think Bob's got one with some difficult names in it too. But let's go ahead, Brother Bob, and get the Isaiah passage as well.
At that time, Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and was recovered. And Hezekiah was glad of them, and showed them the house of his precious things, the silver, and the gold, the spices, and the precious oil, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them. Then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, hear the word of Jehovah of hosts. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in thy house, and all that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says Jehovah. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, whom thou shalt begat, shall they take away. And they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then said Hezekiah unto Isaiah, good is the word of Jehovah which you have spoken. He said, moreover, there shall be peace and truth in my days.
Okay, and then let's go ahead and before we get into the discussion of this and get 2 Chronicles 32. What is it, 24 through 26 and 31? All right, these 2 Chronicles 32 passages are really key to understanding all this. Let me get one more volunteer. Somebody just maybe kind of sum this up for us and give us a Reader's Digest version of what's happened here. Anybody? Yeah, the long and short of it is the king of Babylon has heard that Hezekiah was sick. Now he's better. So he sends a gift. And he sends ambassadors, envoys, however you want to word that. And they come with letters, probably I would assume letter from the king, an official document sealed and delivered. You know, here's a letter from the king himself and a gift. We're so glad to see you feeling better again. And Hezekiah, he shows them all through his place and upsets God because of his pride, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Before we get to that, he shows them everything, and you know, you again, we'll talk more about pride in just a moment. But Hezekiah is going to be asked this question: what have they seen in thine house? And really, in short, what is the answer? Everything. They've seen everything. So Isaiah says, well, the days are coming when kind of everything that they've seen is going to be taken. They're going to take it into Babylon. Your sons are going to be made eunuchs. They're going to be taken off into a foreign land. And of course, this was fulfilled and beginning in 606 BC, around that time, give or take a few years. Most people say give or take a year or so. 606, 596, 585, or 86. 3 different times that Babylon came against Jerusalem. The third time actually just completely leveling the city and the temple, burning it with fire. But in that first attack in 606, many of them were taken captive. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, if you want to use their Hebrew names. They were taken. Ezekiel ends up among the captives. I don't think we're sure if he was the first or the second carrying away. But each time people are taken into captivity. And so that's the fulfillment of this. It's kind of interesting that the way, I don't know what translation you're reading from there, Billy. ESV. It kind of gets Hezekiah's reaction pretty well there. I mean, Hezekiah basically says, the ESV has it, why not? As long as it's going to be peace in my day. Kind of an odd reaction from an otherwise good king. But I want us to notice something here as we kind of look into what happened here with Hezekiah, because we remember Hezekiah as a good king, right? When you study Scripture, what are some of the highlights? Anybody? What do you think about when you think of Hezekiah? He was going to die, and he prays to God. In fact, we looked at that and see, we did just, 2 or 3 weeks ago studying about grief. You see Hezekiah grieving there. I mean, he's in kind of despair and asks God, and God extends his life. What else comes to mind with Hezekiah? Put away a lot of idolatry. In fact, there was one idol that had been around since the days of Moses. What was it? Anybody remember this? Think back to Numbers 21. The brazen serpent. In Numbers 21, they were murmuring. God sent fiery serpents. They repent. They turn back to God. They cry out to God for mercy. God tells Moses, you make a serpent of brass, put it on a pole, and anybody that looks, well, they live. Well, apparently, they held on to that thing, and at some point began to worship it as some kind of an idol. Hezekiah says, no more of that. I'm destroying that thing because people are worshiping it. That was a good thing, wasn't it? What else was observed during Hezekiah's reign that hadn't been observed like that in many, many years? That should have been every single year. I thought somebody said it. The Passover. They observed the Passover. I mean, it had not been observed that way in years. And so Hezekiah, and I'm not trying to knock Hezekiah overall. I don't think this text is meant to say to us, forget everything you've ever known about Hezekiah. He was really bad and rotten. But he was a human, right? And, was David a good king? Was David a righteous king? Sure. Was David perfect? No. David was human. So was Hezekiah. What we see here, and of course, that's the reason we study these great questions of the Old Testament. That was one of the reasons we chose this as the theme for this year, following up great questions from the New Testament, is because these things are written for our learning, Romans 15:4. God, we're under the New Testament, but God has given us the Old Testament, and we study it because there's so much we can learn from it. But I want you to think about this. Hezekiah had just witnessed, just bang, 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 leading up to this account, 3 remarkable, tremendous miracles. What were they? Yeah, that's number 1. In 2 Kings 18 and 19, this is also recorded in Isaiah, but in 2 Kings 18 and 19, Sennacherib comes and he goes against the northern kingdom of Israel, and they fall, and they fell because of their idolatry, which ironically, and worse so, is eventually why the southern kingdom will fall as well. And the southern kingdom, I say worse so, because they should have learned. They should have learned from the mistakes of the northern kingdom. But they're going to fall because of their idolatry later on. But Assyria comes against the northern kingdom, takes them into captivity. So from that point forward, there is no more northern kingdom. There really is no more northern southern kingdom. There's just Judah. And then eventually Judah falls, and after the captivity, 70 years of captivity in Babylon, not Sennacherib, Cyrus decrees anyone who wants of the Jews can return home. Some of them will, many of them will. By the way, just to make it clear, the premillennial idea of 10 lost tribes that are eventually going to go back to the land of Palestine or something is completely debunked in the book of Ezra, because you can find where people from every single tribe came back to the homeland. There are no lost tribes out there that need to come back. They all during that time came back. Some from each tribe came back. Now it's still a relatively small number. Many of them are just dispersed, and even in the New Testament you'll sometimes read about the dispersion, and that's what that's talking about, Jews that are just scattered all over the Roman Empire. But Sennacherib, he conquers the northern kingdom. Well, like any king set on world domination would do, where does he turn his sights next? To their neighbor, right? And he's looking down south. Here comes Judah. In fact, it's one of those archaeological evidences of inspiration. Sennacherib has some chronicles that history has found. I was trying to remember if anybody that studied archaeology remembers the name of It's like right on the tip of my tongue. But anyways, it's something archaeologists have discovered, and they've given a name, but it's like historical records of Sennacherib. It's driving me crazy. It's something that's right there. It just makes me so frustrated. But anyways, I'll probably remember right after church tonight. But Sennacherib made a note in his historical records that he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. But strangely, the record just stops there. And why is that? If he conquers him, and he conquers the southern kingdom just like he did the northern kingdom, he finishes that record, but he didn't. Why? Well, because, as Brother Allen mentioned, and it's actually just previous, if you go back to the reference in 2 Kings, it's just right before the account we just read in chapter 19. It's at the end of 19. Hezekiah starts off, by the way, interestingly, if you go back into 18, he first says, in verse 15, Hezekiah's giving silver, all the silver found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord, from the pillars. The king of Assyria sends these people, and at one point you've even got Hezekiah saying, it's verse 14. He says, I've offended, return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear. I'll pay your tribute, Sennacherib. And so the king of Assyria appointed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. So that's when he starts going for silver and gold anywhere he can find it. And so then he just decides, we're not really told why, presumably because Hezekiah just can't come up with enough gold and silver anymore. And so he decides he's going to come and he's going to conquer Judah. But Hezekiah finally gets a little smarter about this thing, and instead of trying to just take gold and silver from wherever he can find it, instead of sending messengers over to Egypt and saying, please come help us, we'll pay you, he goes to God. And all that is to say, when you get down to chapter 19, man, I love chapter 19, the message that Isaiah comes back from Jehovah, and he comes back to Hezekiah with this message. It begins in verse 20. It really goes to near the end of the chapter, but man, I love, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee, laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee. Sennacherib, you are nothing. Isn't that something coming from little old Judah here at this time? They were nothing in the eyes of the world. Man, verse 27, God says to Sennacherib, I know where you live. I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against who? Me, God says. Because thy rage against me and thy tumult has come up into mine ears, therefore I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips. Well, the Assyrians love to do that to their captors. Put a hook in their nose, run a chain through it, link all the captors together. That makes sure nobody's going to make a run for it, right? Sometimes they would do like a bridle on their lips, pierce the lips, same thing, running captives together. Very cruel. God says, you're going to reap what you've sown. I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest. He says in verse 32, therefore thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city, to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000 troops in one night. That'll end it, won't it? Yes, sir. The Sennacherib prism. Thank you. Oh, man, thank you. That was driving me crazy. The Sennacherib prism, that's where that's found, where Sennacherib says he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. Archaeologists discovered that, and then the record just mysteriously ends there. The reason is right here. 185,000 soldiers die in one night. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departs, verse 36. He goes and returns, dwelt at Nineveh, and then he's worshiping his idol, Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, came and smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. This was the first, in some ways you might even say one of the biggest, if not the biggest, of these three miracles. God saves Hezekiah and the entire nation of Judah from Assyria. I mean, just amazing. Sennacherib has laid siege to the city. He's got them trapped. There's nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nothing to do. And then all of a sudden, 185,000 people turn up dead. Well, time to go home. What's number 2? Before that. Yeah. Just continuing at the text, right into verse 20. Hezekiah was sick unto death. And so Isaiah comes to him and says, what? Set your house in order, Hezekiah. You're not recovering from this one. It was some kind of a boil. We know that. Probably an infection or something. But he says, you need to set your house in order because you're not going to recover from this. And Hezekiah turned his face to the wall. He prays. Begs God. He says, remember, God, I've been faithful. I've been a good king. And he's not trying to brag on himself. He's pleading and begging. And this is that despair that we talked about in the grieving process. And he wept sore, verse 3 says at the end. Before Isaiah was gone out into the middle court, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, turn again. Tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I've heard thy prayer. I've seen thy tears. Behold, I will heal thee. On the 3rd day thou shalt go up unto the house of the Lord. I will add unto thy days 15 years. And I will deliver thee and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria. And I will defend this city for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. Isaiah said, take a lump of figs. And they took it and laid it on the boil, and he recovered. So that's miracle number 2. Hezekiah recovers from this illness that was going to take his life. And then number 3 is what? The sun going backwards. Now, some people say, well, God just made the shadow go backwards. Some people say God made the sun go backward. Let me tell you something. Either way, you're looking at a bona fide miracle. There's no doubt about it. If you make a shadow go backwards on a sundial, that's a miracle. If you make the sun go backwards, that's a miracle. Either way, I don't know which one happened. I know the shadow went backward. If the sun itself went backward, that would make the shadow go back. May just be the shadow. We're not told 100% for sure. But that's miracle number 3, verses 8 through 11. Hezekiah says, well, what's the sign that the Lord's going to heal me and that I shall go up into the house of the Lord the 3rd day? This is not a Pharisaical, give us a sign. Show us if you are the true, Christ. That's what the Pharisees always asked Jesus, and he rebuked them for that. Hezekiah is just saying, is there a sign? Can I have a sign? We talked, I think it was... Who talked about Gideon? Was that last week? Was that Barry the Third last week? Did he talk about Gideon? Why then is all this, if the Lord's among us, why is all this evil befalling us? Anyways, it was fairly recently of our summer series. Gideon did the same thing. Give me a sign, Lord. And he's not just trying to tempt the Lord. He wants to make sure. Isaiah said, this sign shalt thou have of the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees or go back 10 degrees? Hezekiah says, well, it's a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees. Over a few minutes' time, the shadow is going to go forward 10 degrees. But you know what? It ain't ever going backwards. So he says, how about that? Let the shadow return backward 10 degrees. And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz. 3 astounding miracles that Hezekiah had just witnessed. That sets the stage for when Merodach-Baladan sends ambassadors with a gift. Hezekiah shows them his treasury, his armory, all of his precious oils. He showed them everything. And you know what? Hezekiah got duped. I read one fellow said, you better be careful what you show your enemy. These were not friends. Oh, they came, we're so glad to see you feeling better. Are there people that will pretend to be friends to take advantage of you? You better believe it. Hey, look, we're so glad you're feeling better. And, we're not told. They may not have come expressly with the intent of playing up to him and spying. That may not have been their full purpose. But they end up going home and saying, wow, Hezekiah's got some stuff. And you're going to want that stuff, king. And it's just a matter of time before he's coming to get it. Be careful what you show your enemy. I think there's a spiritual application there. 2 Corinthians 2:11, talking about Satan, it says, we are not ignorant of his devices. If the devil tries to play up to you and pretend to be nice to you, I'm talking figuratively, obviously, the devil's not going to come up to you himself. You better be careful what you're showing your enemy. Here's an interesting thought. It's not original with me. I read this somewhere. The idea that God essentially made Hezekiah, if this were a trial, and by the way, bear in mind, every Bible passage has three contexts. What are they? There's an immediate context, obviously. We're looking at an immediate context here of Hezekiah was sick, he got better, ambassadors came, he shows them his house, he gets rebuked for it. There's what? What's number two? What'd you say? Well, that's kind of ties in with number three. And I don't know if these are in any particular order, but every context has three. I'm thinking historical context, looking at the history of the nations around and the culture and things like that. There's a historical context here. Assyria has risen to power. They're conquering the known world, and they've got their sights set on Judah. That fails. Babylon is starting to gain traction at this point. By the way, did you notice about the time Assyria loses traction? It's about the time that they lose 185,000 soldiers in one night. That'll do that to your army, won't it? So Babylon's starting to kind of rise to the top. Assyria is on the decline. Those things play into the historical context. And then kind of their, I don't know how you want to call it, there's a future context or an overall biblical context, if you want to call it that. The overall context here, and don't miss that. We sometimes miss that when we're studying a passage. The overall context here is God is incubating a nation to bring in the Messiah. And the overall context going right with that, and this is really key to the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. Over and over again you see it. Miracle after miracle, rebuking people, sending prophets to other places, and it's all about one thing. There is one God, and He is Jehovah. Your idols, they're nothing. And nobody, more so than God's people, should show that to the world. And here is a situation, here's a whole context where God has called what we might call, if you want to put it in a courtroom setting, a star witness. He's called the star witness to the stand. Here is Hezekiah, this star witness, to witness, to testify that God is the one true God. There is no God but Jehovah. You see this over and over again. In fact, it's just back over in 1 Kings chapter 18. We've been in 2 Kings 18, 19, and 20. But in 1 Kings 18, a prophet named Elijah, he's on Mount Carmel. How long halt you between two opinions? I think Brother Mike Benson had that topic. And that was his great question of the Old Testament. Elijah calls down fire from heaven. The prophets of Baal, they cry, they scream, they cut themselves, nothing happens. Elijah calls once, and fire comes down. It consumes the sacrifice. It consumes the rocks that had already been, by the way, saturated with water, right? And even pooled around in the trench about the altar. The sacrifice, the wood, the rocks, everything is just consumed. And what do the people do? They're terrified, and they begin to shout, almost like a chant. And what are they saying? The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. Over and over again. That's what it's about. God is saying over and over again, I am the true and living God. And He's made Hezekiah a star witness. And yet, you know what happens sometimes? Sometimes you hear about courtroom drama, And you get the star witness on the stand, and what? Sometimes they just refuse to testify. Or sometimes they just, worst case scenario, they completely change their story. And man, Hezekiah gets on the stand, as it were, and he refused to testify. And what a tragedy that is. So God is testing Hezekiah. Here's a man who he had just faced very serious threats, not only to himself, to his personal safety, but national security. And if ever there was a time to be humble and to rely on God and give God all the praise and the glory, you'd think this would be it, right? Everybody's talking about Hezekiah. Why is everybody talking about Hezekiah right now? Well, those 3 miracles, right? I mean, do you think word like that spreads? Like wildfire. I mean, especially, here's Assyria. They're on the decline. Did you hear what happened to Assyria? I mean, it's almost like overnight. They're not really nearly as big a threat anymore. 185,000 soldiers in a night are gone. And so these Babylonian ambassadors, they bring a gift. And getting back again to 2 Chronicles, verse, I just lost it, 31. Howbeit in the business of the ambassadors, the princes of Babylon, who sent unto him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him to try him, to test him, that he might know all that was in his heart. And so the test is these ambassadors, these envoys, bringing a gift. And the text says in 2 Kings 20, verse 13, that Hezekiah hearkened unto them. It seems like he maybe feels like a little bit of a celebrity at this point. Oh, you heard about that? You heard about my sickness and how God recovered me? And it seems like he's not even mentioning God much in this. Maybe he says, you heard about my sickness and how I got better? You heard about the sun going backward? Oh, you heard about how we were under duress and all of a sudden we came out victorious? It seems to be that what he's doing is telling them all about his efforts, his successes, his stuff. Reminds me very much of Nebuchadnezzar. You get over into Daniel chapter 4. He's walking through the palace. He'd already been warned about it. And he says, is not this great Babylon that I have built? He kind of says, I did it all. And God says, oh, no, you didn't. You are so wrong, Nebuchadnezzar. And he lost his kingdom for a time until he learned some humility. It seems he made this all about himself. What an opportunity Hezekiah had to tell these men about the God of heaven. Can you imagine if he had said something like, we were just so helpless against Sennacherib, but Jehovah, he is the true God. He intervened. There was no idol that could help us. Look at all the idols that Sennacherib had defeated, their peoples. But Jehovah's the true God, you see, and we cried out to him. We serve him. We're faithful to him, and he saved us. What about, I was dying. God gave me more time. God healed me. He miraculously healed me because he's the one true God. He's the only one that could do that. What about Hezekiah saying, you know what, God made the sun go backward just as a sign of his grace toward me in that matter of the healing? He didn't do any of that. He failed the test, and that's verses 24 through 26 of 2 Chronicles 32. He rendered not again according to the benefit done unto him, verse 25 says, for his heart was lifted up. Therefore there was wrath upon him and upon Judah and Jerusalem. We often speak of trials as tests, don't we? We talk about trials and we say sometimes this is a test. And in fact, we talked about this a lot, 2 Sundays ago after PTP, how God uses our problems. Trials are tests, but you know what? I know sometimes we're tested just as much by triumphs, by successes, as we are by trials. Isn't that a fact? You see sometimes people that are faithful in hard times, but then things get great and they fall away. They have success, they have triumph, and they fall away from God. Success can be a test just as much as a trial or suffering. Who's got an ASV Bible? American Standard 1901. Anybody? Bob? I knew I was going to come to you, and I thought I wasn't sure if you had it. Proverbs 27, verse 21. I want you to listen to this verse. It's a little more clearly worded in the ASV and some other versions too.
The refining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold, and a man who is tried by his praise. Though thou should bray a fool in water with a pestle along through his train, yet will not his foolishness depart.
The refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, and a man is tried by his praise, by his success. Hezekiah failed this test. When Isaiah asked him, "What have they seen in thine house?" He could have said, but he didn't. He could have said, they heard words of praise, glorying God for all that he had done for us, thanksgiving to God. He could have said, "I told them there's no God like Jehovah in all the earth." He didn't tell them that. He could have said, "I told them they can serve the one true God, and you know what? He'll help them too. He's not just the God of Israel. He had a special relationship with Israel, a special covenant with them, because they were going to bring in the Messiah." But that's the message of the book of Jonah, as much so as anywhere else in the Old Testament, is that God is not just interested in the Jews in the Old Testament times. He's very much concerned about the Gentile nations as well. He could have told them that. Look, you serve God and He'll help you too. But He didn't. God had attracted the attention of a nation hundreds of miles away. And because of that, no doubt He expects Hezekiah to give God the glory. But Hezekiah does not. Hezekiah's bragging, ironically, ends up causing them to covet his treasures. And they're going to come and they're going to take them away. Thankfully, this story does not end just with that, because verse 26 tells us, "Notwithstanding, Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord came not upon them in the days of Hezekiah." That's why you got to put 2 Chronicles 32 with Isaiah 39 and 2 Kings 20 to understand why Isaiah says it's not going to happen in your days. He humbled himself. He repented. He changed that prideful behavior. There are a lot of applications we could make here, but I think one of the biggest ones that comes to my mind, and maybe about the only one, time gets away, but I think about, there's a lesson here obviously with pride. How we are tried sometimes just as much by success as we are by failure and by suffering and by trials. How do we respond to that? Who are we when nobody's looking? It's almost as if Hezekiah got out of his trouble spot, sickness, being laid siege to by Sennacherib, and now things are going great, and it's almost like God's getting treated like a spare tire, right? Spare tires are great to have when you have a blowout, when you have a flat tire and you need a change on the side of the interstate or something. But what do you do with a spare tire when you're not having a problem with your tire on the road? You just tuck it away somewhere out of sight, out of mind, right? You don't even think about it. In fact, sometimes, like in 2014, you're headed up around Clemson, like I was, and you have a blowout and you realize, oh, wait a minute. Well, no, we had a spare tire. We had bought a used vehicle, and nobody ever thinks to check when you buy a used vehicle, is the spare tire jack there? It wasn't. But that's kind of how a spare tire is, right? You don't think about it until you need it. Sometimes when you need it, it's not there. But it's like Hezekiah's treating him, and sometimes we do that, don't we? We kind of treat God like a spare tire. I'll just pull you out when I need you. Who are we when nobody is looking? And one of the great lessons here is that God's always looking. God always sees. And that's not meant to be a frightening thought. That should be a comforting thought. If we're people of integrity and people of character. There's so many things we could talk about ways in which people get I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. Try to word it. What'd you say? Complacent, yeah. And little things that we would call little, where people show a lack of character, lack of integrity. It might be, what somebody would call a white lie. It might be cheating on taxes. It might be things that nobody would see. He said, well, nobody knows, but God knows, right? And so what have they seen in thine house? I'm just going to save it because I can use it later on. I may just preach it. I wanted to go it's a completely different direction, so it makes sense to be a different lesson anyways. But what have they seen in our house? There's a congregational application. What do people see when they come here? And maybe it's a visitor. Maybe it's somebody who is a member of the Lord's church, but they're visiting. What have they seen in our house? And not talking necessarily about a physical structure, but... And then there's also another application that we'll look at in a separate sermon sometime for the home. Our individual homes, our families, what have they seen in your house? That's not the context of this, but I've heard of sermons being done from that, and I want to kind of explore that at some point. But who are we when nobody's looking? Let's be people of character. Let's learn from Hezekiah's mistake and make sure God always gets the credit. God always gets the glory. Thank you so much for your time and attention. That'll officially wrap up our summer series. And in, 3 Wednesdays, we will dive into looking at the book of Revelation. So I look forward to that study. Thank you very much.